Led Zeppelin seemed to arrive from nowhere, but the sheer power and exuberance of this fledgling band grabbed the listener by the throat and told the whole world that something new and quite remarkable had happened. The greatest band in the history of rock had just been born.
They played it in a very in-your-face way. There was so much passion and fire in it. No one had heard it played like that before, which really gave it some power and terrific amount of impact.
The secret of Led Zeppelin's success lay in the four amazingly talented individuals who made up the band.
You've got Jimmy Page, who is the magus of guitar. You've got John Paul Jones, who is the second to join. And I believe that both gentlemen met at a session for Donovan's Hurdy-Gurdy Man. Then we've got Robert Plant, possibly one of the finest men to ever draw breath and strut his stuff on stage like a proper rock star. And he's mates with John Bonham.
Jimmy Page has an amazing pedigree as a session player. He was one of the most in-demand session players in England. He played on sessions for everyone from the Kinks, The Who, Joe Cocker, Jackie DeShannon. This was a musicologist. John Paul Jones, like Jimmy Page, really garnered great experience being a session player. And what John Paul Jones also did, he was also an arranger. He worked with the Rolling Stones, he worked with Herman's Hermits, he worked with Donovan. So John Paul Jones really brought a lot to the band. I always think in a way he was the secret weapon, because not only was he this amazing, amazing bass player, but he was a great arranger and he could play great keyboards. He would play mellotron, Hammond organ, clavinet. So this was a guy who really could bring a great deal to Zeppelin.
Jimmy Page was a master in bringing John Paul into the group. He knew that John Paul was an arranger, he was a session guy. Jimmy had done session work with John Paul on various sessions, Donovan and Lulu. And
the thing about, I suppose, with Jimmy and John Paul Jones being in the studio environment for so long, that having two other people that had not been in it but were actually live players, that combination of quality of players coming, sort of colliding with a total undisciplined sort of playing, gave it such a completely original feel. There were these two guys that played live and played the blues live, and there was these two other guys that had to be disciplined in the studio. I mean, they were great players, there's no question about that, but the two different things colliding gave it a completely different look and feel.
They hit the ground running with an amazing debut album. It was recorded in just 8 days at a cost of just £800, and that included the artwork on the cover.
Debut album straight in at number 10. You've got tracks like Communication Breakdown, and then you've got the blues power of You Shook Me Baby, Baby I'm Gonna Leave You.
Babe, 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 you know I've got to rumble.
The band itself was obviously very hot. They just got together. They'd only been rehearsing for a short time before. They went straight in the studio and recorded it. And they were getting off on what each other were doing. It was all captured, fortunately, by Glyn Johns, the engineer, who worked on the session, and got this kind of magical sound. I don't know why, but lots of echo, I suppose. First use of special effects on the guitars. The way the drums were recorded to get extra power. And the fact that they were quite experimental in blending tracks together, like Black Mountainside and Communication Breakdown. They seemed to meld into each other. It wasn't like a normal album in many respects.
Within a very short space of time, the band took off in America. This was thanks in no small part to the business sense and the guile, the cunning and the charm, and the force of will from their manager Peter Grant.
Peter Grant was an all-powerful figure. He was really the fifth member of Led Zeppelin. He understood them, he knew what they wanted, and he'd come up with the idea really with Jimmy Page, the pair of them, and out of the ashes of the Yardbirds, when that broke up in the States. Peter had been the manager, the last manager of the Yardbirds, and when the band had decided to pack it in, I remember, I think Peter asked Jimmy, well, what do you want to do now? And he said, well, I'd like to form a band. So obviously Peter volunteered to help him form a new group. And really, together, they formed the concept of Led Zeppelin.
Despite the fact that the band had only a limited repertoire of original songs, the four musicians shared a love for blues and rock and roll classics, so Zeppelin could quite happily play a 2 or 3 hour set, which drove audiences into frenzy. Those early shows already featured an amazing version of Dazed and Confused. Zeppelin featured this track on a few television shows, which they did record.
Piece that Jimmy had been working on before with the old Yardbirds, but built to a crescendo with to a new peak of excitement. They weren't just bashing out 12-bar blues by any means, full of dynamics and lows and highs, and obviously they knew when to stop and when not to play. That was one of John Bonham's big facets, really. One of his skills was that although he was incredibly powerful and would play battering drum fills, he knew when to stop and not play anything at all, which was just as much of a shock. Very few bands know how to do that, even now, how to use silence and gaps, and sort of like you can hear a pin drop, and the contrast would be like a devastating, even more powerful.
Page takes you into the darkest, deepest depths of his guitar playing, and Plant delivers probably one of the finest performances of his career.
It's got an intensity, and it's got a vibe to it, and I think all their stuff about emotions, about competitiveness, about jealousy, about the dark side, about on the road, anything it was always very emotive. They always managed to get a lot of fire in your belly, and that was really exciting. So we put on a CD of Zeppelin. It's exciting even today.
With America already under the spell of Led Zeppelin, all that remained was to put Zeppelin on the map in the UK. This was achieved by a single, groundbreaking appearance before 200,000 fans at a festival in Somerset near Bath. Zeppelin hit the stage just as the sun set, and soon won over the huge crowd with a blistering set which drew heavily on material for the band's second album.
Led Zeppelin 2, which came out in October 1969, was the long-awaited follow-up, obviously, to the first album, which people were thinking, can they do it again? Could they be as all-powerful as they were on that debut? And the fact was, Led Zeppelin 2 was just as, if not more, exciting.
It blew me away because that was the record where it really was the headphone record. It was a record where Jimmy Page and Eddie Kramer really worked carefully on developing these mixes that really exploited all different sounds and textures. And when you listen to it, it was a mind trip.
Extraordinarily simple song. There are 2 chords in the whole song. It's E and D, and that's the entire song. And the other element of that song that was perfect was Jimmy Page's solo in the middle. Those, what is that, an 8 or 16 bar solo, dun, 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 dun.
It's my favorite guitar solo of all time. Page lets loose this flurry of notes that are so moving and emotional. And the way he was able to achieve this really powerful sound was he was playing it. He was playing the guitar through an amp, and I think he was reversing. The wah-wah was pressed down in, so it gave it this extra treble, this extra boost. So really, when the solo comes in, it really rips your head off.
Zeppelin were already huge, and a constant round of touring only served to enhance their status. On record, Zeppelin were superb, but on stage they became something truly outstanding. In the words of that immortal phrase, they were tight but loose. No other rock band on the planet has ever come this close to this magical ability to merge structured songs around unstructured improvisations and seamlessly blend the two together.
The thing is, the songs were great, then when you expanded them and jammed them, they were still great. I mean, if you do a long drum solo or you do a long guitar solo, or it would still come back to a great song. See, I think bands miss that. You know, for me, you know, it's all very well jamming, but if you always come back to a great song, then it's an absolute great moment. And not only were they great players, and not only could they really play and could they jam, and as well as the songs being great, they looked amazing. I mean, they seriously looked amazing. I mean, you were just, that look of that band on stage, you know, with Robert and Jimmy, it was just unbelievable. And when Jimmy had, you know, these long trousers with things up the side, and Robert's hair and everything, it was a photographer's dream. It was like a record company marketing person's dream. And you had a great looking band who were absolutely brilliant.
Material on record. Retiring to a cottage in the Welsh Mountains, Zeppelin began working up new material. This was undoubtedly a quieter, more reflective album, but it was a classic nonetheless.
I just think it's a progression. I think musically they progressed. I think they were always striving not to try and copy the last one. It was hard because, you know, when you make an album that's as good as 2, must be tough. It's like following Sgt. Pepper. You know, you follow with things that are a bit more diverse. I think 3 was slightly more diverse, like the White Album was more diverse than Sgt. Pepper. I think you just strive to do and because like any musicians, you want to move on. But again, you know, I think they're shrewd enough to know what the public would want.
You know, with Immigrant Song, again, 3rd album, 3rd opening track, which is just a stonker.
When Led Zeppelin decided to record their 3rd record, they wanted to do something different than the first 2, which were very, you know, much heavier and much harder oriented. That was a much softer record. That was a record which had songs like Tangerine and That's the Way that were showcasing their folk roots and showcasing perhaps their love of people like Joni Mitchell. But Immigrant Song was a song that really fit the template of what people knew Led Zeppelin for, this gargantuan monster guitar riff and Plant singing about the gods.
Robert Plant sort of got his Valkyrie song of the screaming Viking, the north wind coming, blowing over the winter hinterland, kind of howls over it. It was an interesting image. Valhalla, you have come. Interesting image. He was into that. Plant was heavily into that Nordic mythology. What made him interesting as a lyricist, that he was into lots of different elements.
Sales-wise, the 3rd Zeppelin album kept up the momentum. The wider range of musical references also helped to bring extra light and shade to the crucial on-stage performances.
Rolling Stone was brutal to Led Zeppelin. They were basically letting people know that they thought the band was trash and there were no talents. So the band and the press always had this adversarial relationship. For many, many years, they seldom did interviews because of it. And you know what? Let's face it, they didn't really need to do interviews at that point. They were huge. They were selling out all over the world.
By late 1971, Zeppelin were already a worldwide phenomenon, and things were about to get even better. The band retired to Headley Grange to begin the process of recording their 4th album. It was to become an all-time classic.
I suppose it's still regarded as the ultimate Led Zeppelin album, really, because it had so many great performances on it. When the Levee Breaks was one particular one I liked, as well as Rock and Roll, and of course Stairway to Heaven. So you couldn't do better, really, could you?
There's a lady who's sure all that glitters is gold, and she's buying the stairway to heaven.
The band now took the album on the road with a worldwide tour which took in the USA, Japan and Australia, where audiences were introduced to the Led Zeppelin experience with a blistering version of rock and roll.
To write a song called Rock and Roll, and millions of people have tried it, and it's really cheesy and hammy and uncool. And they just made it sing, and they made it real. And it's really well played, the vocals are great. Again, you know, it's hard to criticise.
Houses of the Holy was the next building block in the Zeppelin story, and once again the band showed its willingness to experiment.
Houses of the Holy was Led Zeppelin's fifth album, which came out in Europe in March 1973, and it had several hard acts to follow, really. They'd already sort of created a legend around themselves with a succession of brilliant albums, but this one, for some reason, it didn't quite work. Not for me, personally, anyway. It kicked off very well with The Song Remains the Same, which was the first track. It was a very powerful piece. And I thought, well, this augurs well, it's going to be a great album. But then somewhere along the line, somewhere along the way, it kind of veered off course. And although they'd experimented on the third album, and I approved of all their experiments thus far, but suddenly they were trying to experiment with stuff like Jamaica, which was I thought was an ill-considered venture into reggae, and The Crunge, which was okay, but it was a sort of James Brownish thing. I think it was meant to be a bit funky, but for me it didn't really work. I don't know why.
By 1973, Zeppelin were the biggest band on the planet. Much of that success was down to their truly awesome live shows.
They would take great rock and roll tracks, great soul tracks, they would take just great musical tracks, and live they would go into jam improvisational pieces where they would pull elements of great rock songs, great soul songs, just songs that the band knew and were telepathically in tune with.
They loved to dig back to all their roots, which was rock and roll, the original rock and roll. So they would often do rock and roll classic numbers, Elvis numbers, and Eddie Cochran and Little Richard. Play all those tunes.
Like most purists, you always think, why do they do it? But then the Beatles did it, and the Stones do it, and Zeppelin do it. And I just think that they always did everything with taste. I mean, I think to me that's the key really for Zeppelin. You know, they were a high energy, high quality, great rock and roll band, and I think that they managed to put their own twist on things. Without trying to make it sound like they were over trying.
Offstage, Zeppelin were also getting a reputation for excess of all kinds.
You read the stories about throwing stuff out of hotel windows, destroying hotels. You've got to remember, this is a band that was on tour constantly.
After a really bad day, I can imagine them losing their temper and getting fed up, because travelling is no fun at all. And groups like Led Zeppelin, I mean, it's hard to believe now the touring that they did, day after day. I mean, it would wipe me out. If I went on the road with Zeppelin for 3 or 4 days, I'd come back completely shattered, and I hadn't played a note, I'd just been watching. Just from the travelling and the excitement and the hurry up and wait thing, which all bands have to do. You know, you've got 5 hours to kill sitting in a trailer somewhere in the Midwest, maybe in a city you don't even know where you are, and you've got to go out and play to an audience where there's maybe tear gas going off, fireworks thrown at the stage, and you've got to do a whole lot of love and Stairway to Heaven all over again, night after night. So, you know, you can imagine the physical and emotional and mental pressure on guys in their 20s. Great fun that may be, but after you've done it for 6 months at a time, the thought of getting up in the morning and flying to another city, it's pretty daunting, really. So people would take it out in, probably that would lead on to taking stimulants to try and ease the pain, I think.
I know loads of people that are not in this business that are excessive. I know thousands of people in the entertainment media industry that are excessive. So what? You know, I mean, that is a lifestyle they loved. That's a lifestyle they lived by, you know. And you can't criticise, and I don't think anyone has the right to really opinionate on it. I find that that's what does people's brains in. That everyone has an opinion on someone else's lifestyle. I think that's their business, and their little devils they deal with. You know, some people can handle it, some people can't. Some people get away with it, some people don't. Good or bad? Sure, there's bad moments. I'm sure there were great moments. A lot of people put what went on off stage to the great moments. A lot of people put what went off stage to the bad moments. They're probably right in both cases.
Whatever may or may not have gone on off stage, in the recording studio, Zeppelin were as proficient as ever. Their next album was a double, Physical Graffiti, and it was obvious that the band had produced a masterpiece.
Well, in my opinion, I think Physical Graffiti was certainly one of the most powerful statements from Led Zeppelin. I wouldn't say necessarily it was entirely their best work. I mean, it was a double album, so you'd expect from a double album maybe double the quantity of great material.
For a double album, along with probably the White Album, and Exile on Main Street, the only double albums worth listening to, because most double albums are just you know, packed out, and they'd probably be great single albums. Well, I think Physical Graffiti is a classic double album and is worth every inch of space on those CDs. I love Physical Graffiti. I love everything about it, even right down to the cover. I think it's brilliant.
You got holes in the cover. The expense on that alone is unbelievable. But what you got inside is 2 albums, and they are 2 of the finest albums that Led Zeppelin ever produced. The album, of course, went straight into #1 worldwide, and let's just have a quick look. Let's just a quick butchers, and I'll go through this quickly. Right, side 1. Side 1, Custard Pie, The Rover, and In My Time of Dying. Well, actually, that's side 4 in musical terms, so we'll go backwards. But you cannot argue with any of those tracks. Houses of the Holy, Trampled at Houses of the Holy. That's a cheeky one, isn't it? Putting an album title on an album that wasn't the album. Trampled Underfoot, Kashmir.
Kashmir obviously stands out as probably the best thing they've done since Stairway to Heaven in terms of originality and mood and sophistication of the arrangement, really, with that menacing string sound and hypnotic Eastern rhythm that made Kashmir so unusual and so different. And it worked, you know, it was a kind of a trance-like state was created by that piece, and that was one of the standout tracks on the album. And then Trampled Underfoot, which was a kind of joyous homage maybe to Stevie Wonder in a way, with the electric keyboard that John Paul Jones set up, that fantastic riff.
I read somewhere that Trampled Underfoot was actually, they did it two versions. They did one funk version, which was really funky, which they thought was too funky. Then they came back and made it slightly more rocky and more Zeppy. And I can hear it. You can hear it. And there were loads of tracks on there that could not be Zeppelin, but they were.
There's a musical freedom on that record. They were really able to tackle so many musical styles and genres on that record seamlessly. It's an extraordinary record. I think it stands as one of the best Zeppelin records. I know Robert Plant's very, very fond of that record, as is Jimmy Page. Physical Graffiti captures Led Zeppelin at their incendiary best.
Is this their greatest album? Quite possibly it is their greatest album. But I would have to say 2, 4 and Physical Graffiti are the greatest albums by the greatest band in the world.
With the band riding high in musical terms, it seemed that Zeppelin were unstoppable, but offstage, the dream was about to turn horribly sour.
There was a succession of unfortunate incidents, really, which shocked everybody when, fans of the band were sort of quite stunned, really, when things started to go horribly wrong for the group. For example, Robert was in a car crash on holiday in the Mediterranean, and then there was a fight backstage at a gig in America at a big festival, which involved the road crew mainly and their manager, and John Bonham was involved as well. That was a fight between the band and their various security men, which built up outside the trailer. It was all a silly argument over somebody wanted a souvenir. I think it was Peter's son wanted a souvenir of the band, so he took something off a trailer, the band's name, Led Zeppelin, and that caused the security men to overreact, and the whole thing escalated into a fight, which meant that the group had to face charges.
And they got out on bail, $250 bail, which is incredible when you think of it, $250, and flown straight from San Francisco to New Orleans. And within hours of arriving at New Orleans, Plant gets a call saying that Carrick, his son, has been taken very ill with a stomach bug, but not life-threatening or jump on a plane and get back here now. And within less than 24 hours, he's got another call. An ambulance has been called for the child, and it's tragic. Carrick dies in the ambulance going to hospital.
After a long layoff to reflect and recover, Zeppelin stormed back into action with Presence. There was a distinct impression that the band were no longer firing on all cylinders.
Well, some people sort of expressed the view that Presence was a disappointing album. Whether that's because it was recorded in Musicland Studios or not, I don't know, but whether it had anything to do with the fact that Robert was hobbling around with a crutches, having broken his leg in a car crash. So a lot of things conspired against Zeppelin to produce a good album at that point.
I get the feeling with Presence that it was hard work. That's the thing I get. It was like, maybe it was just a bit hard work and things were a little bit strained and it was tough to get to the nitty-gritty, where I think everything else up to that date was just elating and they were into it and it was fun and they enjoyed it and it was good to do, even though it was tough, and they probably had the usual arguments like every band does, and it was an easy process. Recording isn't easy, but probably maybe when you get to something 5, 6, 7 albums in, it's like, okay, this is going to be tough, and maybe it just wasn't the sparkler they wanted it to be. Who knows?
I think it's probably the most underrated Zeppelin album, Presence is. It was a record where they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know if Plant was going to be able to come back or even have the withdrawal to want to do another record. But like a trooper, he came back. He was on crutches, and it was a record that I know Page and Plant still think very, very highly of. They've included a lot of the music when they've played solo or when they've done the Plant and Page touring. They've included quite a bit of music from that, and I know that they still feel very close to that record. But it's really probably the one Zeppelin album that's lesser known than the others, and it's one that is ripe for discovery.
In contrast to the lackluster album Presence, Zeppelin also unveiled The Song Remains the Same film and accompanying album.
Well, when I first saw The Song Remains the Same was at their premiere in London, and it was a great event because I had a huge party afterwards, which all the band attended. And of course the band were at their peak then, so it was great to be able to see your favourite band on a big screen with the great sound and seeing the band performing live in Madison Square Gardens. I think it was filmed there.
Make you stay.
But in retrospect, it doesn't. Some aspects of it don't really work.
Led Zeppelin wasn't a group that would appear on TV. So the only way you were going to see Led Zeppelin was buying a rock and roll magazine and seeing them some photos, or if you were lucky enough to get a ticket to one of their sold out shows. So this was a great event to be able to actually go to a movie theater and see this extraordinary hard rock band on the big screen.
They tried too hard in that film. It was, and all that editing and cutting and stuff, it just didn't work. I mean, you are what you are. Bands should be what they are. Great films about people on the road should be about what they are. I just think that it's very tough though for them, because I think for any rock band, you know, it's being overcritical really in a way, but you know, the good rock films are people being themselves. You see, I don't think musicians are very good actors. I don't think musicians are very good in front of a camera unless it's a video or a straight live shoot. I think they look awkward and they feel awkward and they don't like it, and that's a fact. And this is not what they bought into rock and roll for. But sometimes someone has a great idea. Let's make another couple of £100 million. We'll put out a film. So I think they go for it. I mean, I don't think it's a complete failure, because it's a great insight into a great band. But I don't know, it didn't do it for me. But there again, I'm really fickle about rock films. I think 99.9% of them are dreadful.
Song Remains the Same was a terrible rock film. It was Zeppelin as kings of the world, trying to tell its audience, this is what we want to be. Beyond that, it was just, musically, it was horrible. I think they had to put together a live video at that point, and I guess this is what they had to work with, because it was monstrously bad.
Actually, if you're going to do a film, or going to do a television show, or anything like that, it has to be done properly with a lot of thought, a lot of time. You don't really have the time, you know. Touring takes up a lot, albums. You know, being musicians, music takes up most of our time. You know, if we were filmmakers, then we could make films.
Zeppelin marked the beginning of the 80s with In Through the Outdoor. Once again, there'd been a long break. The material seemed somewhat thin and somewhat overstretched.
It was a weird one. This was the selling point. You got this sleeve that, you know, was basically something you could buy your kid in any children's shop around the country. Put your painting brush in the water, put it over the page. Oh, it's colourful, it's magical. Jimmy, it ain't that magical, mate. And let's have a look at the tracks. What have we got? In the Evening. Well, I will actually tip my hat to In the Evening. I think that's an excellent song. Southbound Soirée, or Sores, or however you pronounce that. Do you know what? I can't remember it. Fall in the Rain? Now I can't even remember it. Hot Dog? All rightish. Carousel Ambre? Nah. All My Love? Yeah, now you're getting back to a bit of, you know, Zeppelin greatness. And I'm Gonna Crawl. It was a very average album for a great band, and you don't expect that from greatness. Average doesn't come into the equation. When you're great, and when you're average, you're losing it.
It was a hard time for them, really, because, you know, the first flush of youth had gone and all the vibrancy of a new band had kind of dissipated in a way. And it was harder for them to come up with new ideas as well that would be relevant to their past. They had this huge burden in a way of coming up to people's expectations, delivering the old tunes that people wanted to hear, yet at the same time be experimental and do something new, which they could get away with on Led Zeppelin 3 or Houses of the Holy. But at this stage, the whole mood of the music business had changed. Things had moved on. How would Led Zeppelin fit into all that? So it was like a mixture of trying to come up with something new and hang on to their rock and roll roots. Whether that worked or not is a moot point, I think. So it's not a disappointing album, but a slightly confused album, I'd say.
Everyone keeps hammering that album. I think it's one of my favourite records. I think people expect too much. It's no good going to Zeppelin 2 and expecting them to reproduce that 6 or 7 albums on. Why would they want to do that? They're musicians. They want to progress like any artist, actor, poet, as we say again. Why would they want to do that? They're moving on. I don't think it's a weak album at all. I think there's some fantastic moments in it, some great playing and great vocals. They sat back for a while. The presence and song remains the same. They were just doing things, keeping the public happy. They were doing a bit of manoeuvring. Just Robert and Jimmy and Peter Grant were just saying, let's just do a few things. Let's sit back and give ourselves a bit of room to try and change things a little bit. And I just think they were giving themselves a bit of time. And I thought In Through the Outdoor was the beginning of a completely different phase for Zeppelin, which I think would have been unbelievable. And I think, to me, it was like Zepp 1, 5, 6, 7, 8 album, whatever it is on. And I think that was the beginning of a completely new phase, and I think it's a real shame, because to me, that was the beginning of phase 2 of Zeppelin.
In the meantime, of course, punk rock had happened, and people were trying to write Zeppelin off as a spent force, which was not true. I mean, musically, they were still capable of doing great stuff. But they were getting older, they were getting tireder, they were getting exhausted. And so by 1979, it was time to stage a big comeback. And that's when they put on 2 big shows in England, at Nebworth.
It looked like the Zeppelin legend was ready to sail on sedately into the new decade, but tragedy was just around the corner.
I was actually in Holland at the time, with a band called Sad Cafe at a press reception. And somebody came in and told me, or rang me from London to say, had I heard that John Bonham had died? And of course, that was the first I'd heard of it. He died that morning. It was a national newspaper, wanted to know what I thought of it all and what I thought lay behind it. And of course, I had no idea what was behind it. But apparently, they had been rehearsing, and unfortunately, Bonzo had started drinking vodka at the rehearsal. And he collapsed and fallen asleep, and as often happens when people are dead drunk, he didn't wake up. He was suffocated, and he was found by John Paul Jones, who actually found the body. But terrible loss, great tragedy, and of course it led to the demise of Led Zeppelin.
I have total respect for them because no other band had done that. They'd all said, okay, someone dies, we'll get someone else in. They were always replaced. It was always seen as a money-making machine, and it must go on. And Zeppelin, with Bonham's death, had the respect and dignity to say, we can't carry on. It's over. That man was a quarter of the band.